afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. I want to thank the United States Postal Service as well as ASALA for the invitation to be here for this wonderful, and I'm going to cry, celebration. In 1886, Harriet Powers had displayed her Bible quilt at the Northeast Georgia Fair in Athens, Georgia. And Jenny Smith, a local art teacher at an all-white girls' finishing school, offered $10 for it. And Mrs. Powers declined the offer. So fast forward a few years to 1891. The Powers family had some financial difficulty. And Mrs. Powers contacted Jenny Smith to see if she was still interested in purchasing the quilt. And Mrs. Smith said, yes. And so Mrs. Powers and her husband, Armstead, got in a cart, had bundled up the quilt, went to Miss Smith's house, and was prepared to sell the quilt for $10. When they got there, Miss Smith said, I only have $5 to give because I too am having financial difficulties. Well, Mrs. Powers took a moment, because you know how she felt, and she talked to her husband and they conferred, and they said, accept the $5. I stand here today with the supposition that that single decision to accept $5 for a beloved quilt is the reason why we're here today. That decision by the Powers family to sell that quilt, it's why we're here. And why is that? Because Jenny Smith then took the quilt, which she also loved, and she just had it on display at different fairs and so forth, including the Atlanta Cotton Exposition in 1895. And there, women from Atlanta University saw the quilt, and they ended up commissioning Mrs. Powers to make another quilt. I should say that when Mrs. Powers sold her Bible quilt, what we know today as the Bible quilt, for $5, she received from Jenny Smith not only the cash, but a bundle of fabric, scraps, and a promise to come visit at any time she wanted to see the darling of her heart and her brain. That's how much she loved that quilt. I think what I want to share with you next is all the people who have loved and cared for the quilt, because without these people touching it, we wouldn't have the Stamp Commission designing what we see today. And these are the people who kept something, who saw the quilt and said they left evidence that they saw and touched the quilt. And I think it's important to say their names. There was Jenny Smith, the art teacher, who purchased the Bible quilt, the one that's at the Smithsonian, for $5. When she died, her executor and his wife, they didn't sell the quilt as with the contents of her house, but they kept the quilt for about 20 to 25 years before they contacted the Smithsonian to see if the Smithsonian was interested in the quilt, which it was. There was Lorraine Diver, a resident of Keokuk, Iowa, who saw the Bible quilt at the Atlanta Fair in 1895. And Mrs. Divers took a picture of the quilt. And on the back of it, she wrote what each of the blocks were. In some kind of way, that picture, the original picture, is in a file at the Smithsonian American History Museum. And when I was doing research, I saw this picture and I was like, oh, what is this? I've never seen it in the literature. And they're just like, oh, someday we'll get to look at it. Well, I found Mrs. Divers' name on the back of it in Keokuk, Iowa, and did research. Did you know that there was a photograph of Mrs. Powers in a folder at the Historical Society in Keokuk, along with a letter from Mrs. Powers? And again, we wouldn't know all of this except that she sold her quilt for $5. The women from Atlanta University commissioned Mrs. Powers to make a quilt. The quilt was made for Dr. Charles Cuthbert Hall, a former president of the Union Theological Seminary in New York. He received that quilt. It stayed in their family for generations until one of the descendants of Dr. Hall's took the quilt to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts because that family was in financial straits and wanted to see if they would be interested in it. The museum, in fact, did acquire the quilt through a collector for $500. So we have the quilt that it's in the Smithsonian, that's in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, in part because the textile specialists at both museums, Miss Doris Bowman, who I believe is still alive and in her 90s, and Mr. Adolfo Cabello, who is deceased, and he was the one who accepted the Pictorial Quilt. And again, we have to thank them because we wouldn't see the stamp if they hadn't said yes on behalf of their institutions. So now you have the quilts potentially on exhibit at the museums in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And you have an author who we know today as Miss Alice Walker at the Smithsonian, sitting in front of the Bible quilt, which at the time did not have Mrs. Powers' name associated with it. But you have it being something so loved when they saw it, that Mrs. Alice Walker wrote in Search of Her Mother's Garden how she felt and the movement in her heart when she saw Mrs. Powers' quilt. You also have local researchers. Did you know that there was a team of researchers who did, for a few years, research the life of Mrs. Powers and her quilts? There was the late Dr. Gladys Marie Fry at the University of Maryland, and potentially in the audience is William Gelcher, if he's here. There he is back there. You guys, we wouldn't know about the quilt, but for the work that he's doing. That team of researchers that was headquartered at the University of Maryland included not only folklorist researchers, but there was playwrights. There was a group of people who loved those quilts and were determined to find out more about them. You also have, in the 1980s, there was, ridiculous though it sounds today, a debate in the quilt world about what constitutes a black quilt. Go figure. And one of the persons whose voice was so strong saying, a black quilt is just a quilt made by a black person. And we think, of course, that was not the case in the literature in the early 80s. And we have to thank for that Miss Questa Benberry, who's now passed away and was one of my mentors. And she's in the Quilters Hall of Fame. She was a leading American quilt historian. And she wrote about Mrs. Powers and in all of her work. And so that the quilt work could not ignore the creativity and love that Mrs. Powers had in her quilt. We have Mr. Roland Freeman, the late photographer here in the DC area and folklorist, who was one of the first photographers when the quilt was on display at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to bring Mrs. Powers' descendants who had not seen the quilt into a group family picture. And so we're talking decades now, and really a new century now, that the family is there with this historic photograph of one branch of Mrs. Powers' family and the Pictorial Quilt. We have, of course, quilters across the country in guilds who are so inspired that they do make reproductions of the quilts or their interpretation of Bible stories because of Mrs. Powers. And then we have Dr. Carolyn Maslumi, the founder of the Women of Color Quilters Network, whose group 2.5 years ago, worked to install a new headstone for Mr. and Mrs. Powers in Athens, Georgia, at the Gospel Pilgrim Cemetery. If you're ever in Georgia, take a ride over there. It's a phenomenal monument to this creative woman. And of course we have, carrying the legacy of Mrs. Powers, her family and extended family members, including Dr. Mentor, who's going to speak soon. But I just wanted to say that we would not be here today but for the fact that Mrs. Powers was in financial straits and accepted $5 for the darling of her heart and her brain. Enjoy the stamp, buy it, and spread the news. Thank you.